Hey, boys and girls. We are going to read One Giant Leap, the story of Neil Armstrong. When I say ding, you can turn the page. In 1932, 2-year-old Neil Armstrong watched airplanes race. Small, brightly colored planes flashed over Neil and his father, Stephen. The planes raced around a triangle-shaped course, their propellers tearing the sky with a sound that was like an endless thunderclap. The spectacle surely left its mark on young Neil. 4 years later, he leaped at the chance to ride in an airplane. Ding! It wasn't on a racing plane, but a 3-motored passenger plane, nicknamed the Tin Goose. The plane offered rides at the town airport. It could carry about a dozen people. Neil and his father climbed aboard and buckled themselves into wicker seats. The engine sputtered to life with a terrific noise. The airplane raced down the runway and slowly lifted into the sky. As the ground dropped farther and farther below them, people, houses, cars, everything looked smaller. The Tin Goose plowed through the clouds as gusts of wind bounced it up and down. The noisy, bumpy ride and ever-tilting view worried Stephen Armstrong. But Neil was fearless. Neil was delighted. Ding! Neil started making 10-cent airplane models and reading flying magazines. He also started having a magical dream. In it, he held his breath and hovered above the ground. Below him, people, houses, cars, everything looked smaller. Ding! As Neil grew, so did his interest in flying. Hundreds of model airplanes and stacks of air travel magazine began to appear in his bedroom. A job mowing the Mission Cemetery lawn helped pay for it all. At about the age of 11, Neil worked for Neumeister's bakery. Because he was small, Neil was placed into the dough mixing vats to clean them. Ding! He dreamed again and again of hovering. Ding! When Neil was 13, the Armstrongs moved into a big white house on Benton Street in Wapakoneta, Ohio. Neil had been born in the living room of his grandparents' nearby farm on August 5, 1930. Neil was shy and made friends carefully. Still, his life was busy. There was school and Boy Scouts. He played baritone horn in the school band and in a group called the Mississippi Moonshiners. He flew rubber band-powered airplanes from a grassy hill. He worked at the West End Market and Boucher's Hardware, and he swept up and stocked shelves at Ryan and Brading's Pharmacy on Main Street. Ding! On clear nights, Neil climbed to the roof of his neighbor Jacob Zent's garage. Mr. Zent had a homemade telescope mounted there and welcomed visitors to spy the moon and stars. Neil looked and looked and looked. Ding! A few miles from the Armstrongs' home, down the old brewery road, was the Port Coneta Airport. Neil went there to watch the planes take off and land. Sometimes people paid him to wash their planes. But watching and washing were not enough. Neil asked his parents if he could learn to fly. The lessons cost $9 an hour. He would have to work 25 hours to earn enough for 1 hour of flying. His parents agreed. Soon afterward, Neil squeezed himself into a tiny Aeronca Champion airplane with his teacher, Aubrey Newgard. Ding! He learned to take off and land. He learned to climb and swoop and bank. he learned to follow a figure-8 path in the sky. He learned that a pilot and an airplane together could be more than the person or the machine was alone. Neil earned his student pilot's license on his 16th birthday. He was too young to have an automobile driver's license. In time, Neil Armstrong, student pilot, became Neil Armstrong, Navy fighter pilot in the Korean War. Then he was Neil Armstrong, test pilot, flying rocket-powered airplanes to the upper edges of the sky. Eventually, he became Neil Armstrong, astronaut. Astronauts are special pilots who fly spacecraft around Earth. When Neil became an astronaut, there was a plan to land people on the moon and then return them safely to Earth. The moon had gripped people's imagination for thousands of years. On July 16, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins sat in a cramped capsule atop a Saturn rocket. The Saturn was as big as an office building and powerful enough to fling 3 people more than 200,000 miles to the moon. Ding! At 9:32 a.m., the main rocket motors erupted. Flames spewed from the Saturn's tail as it lifted from the ground. Soon the first set of engines exhausted their fuel and fell toward the ocean. Smaller engines sprang to life and sent the capsule circling the globe. After 2 turns around Earth, a final rocket engine blasted the capsule to 25,000 miles an hour, and they hurtled to the moon. Neil, Buzz, and Mike sped through black space for 4 days. The sun's light was broiling hot. The shadows were brutally cold. To prevent one side of the capsule from becoming overheated or frozen, it was turned slowly like a hot dog on a grill. The astronauts called it the barbecue roll. Ding! When they reached the moon, Neil and Buzz entered a special spacecraft designed to part from the main capsule and land on the moon. Mike remained aboard the main capsule to pilot it as the other 2 astronauts dropped to the moon's surface. A computer guided Neil and Buzz, but as they neared landing, Neil saw that there were large boulders in their way. He took control of the craft and slipped it over the obstacles. While he searched for a safer place to land, an alarm blared, warning that they were low on fuel. With only seconds of fuel remaining, Neil safely lowered the hovering spacecraft to the moon's surface. Earthlings Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had finally reached the moon. Ding! Wearing spacesuits and helmets, they opened the hatch of the spacecraft. Before them was the moon, magnificent and empty. Neil climbed down a ladder and hopped to the ground. Special cameras allowed 600 million people on Earth to watch and listen. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, Neil said into his microphone. He gathered moon rocks for scientists to study later. As he worked, his boots left marks in the dust. Neil's footprints may remain there for 1,000,000 years. There is no wind, no rain, and no snow on the moon to disturb them. Ding! Buzz climbed down the ladder and stepped onto the moon's surface. Earth hung above them in a perfectly black sky. North Africa could be seen behind swirling white clouds. Neil shuffled over the powdery surface toward Buzz. The sun shone with a bright white light. They were walking on the moon. Neil stood next to Buzz. Their helmets almost touched. Buzz grinned broadly. Neil clasped his hand on his partner's shoulder. "Isn't it fun?" Neil said. Ding! On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon and became a hero to millions of people. But inside him was the memory of an ordinary boy from Wapakoneta, Ohio. A boy who loved books and music, a boy who was shy and who made friends carefully, a boy who dreamed of hanging in the air suspended only by a trapped breath.